This was around 2 years ago, after going to see a movie with a group of my friends. I live in a small town, so the nearest decent movie theater is about 40 minutes away. I'm always the driver because my car is the most functional for those long distances, and I'm also kind of a softie when it comes to doing favors. This also means I'm always the last one to get home for the night, and it's usually very early in the morning when I finally get home. This specific night, it was pretty late when we got back. Like I said, it's a small town, so when it gets late, the roads are pretty much dead. There's an order that I drop everyone off in, the furthest from my house to the closest, logically. We're pretty spread out from each other. If you've ever been to a rural town, you'll know that there's a lot of twists and turns on back roads like that. I dropped off one of my said friends, and there was only my boyfriend left. I drove towards my boyfriend's house and stopped at a T intersection along the way. The road in front of us was lit with streetlights, but the further you looked down either side of the road, it was dark. There were no cars anywhere, as I expected. I turned onto the road and headed towards my boyfriend's house. Not even a minute down the road, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. I don't know when they'd shown up, but I remember noticing them because the headlights looked like the ones on a friend's car. There were 4 lights, all around, and arranged like the corners of a trapezoid. For a moment, I thought it could be my friend, because the lights were so distinct, but the vehicle looked much larger. I brushed it off and continued driving. We were on one of the main roads, so it didn't surprise me that they continued to follow behind us as we went. After a little while, I turned onto a back road that was pretty hilly, but it was the shortest way to my boyfriend's house. The vehicle turned onto the road as well. It still wasn't that weird. My boyfriend lives in one of an assortment of ranch houses, so we've had a lot of people follow behind us to that section of town, and then eventually taper off into their separate driveways. They were pretty far behind us as well, so I didn't think much of it. Sure enough, they kept taking every turn we took. The closer we got, my boyfriend and I even began to joke about how long they had been behind us. It was only when we turned into his driveway that we grew concerned. He has a long driveway that goes up a hill. I reached the top and could see the vehicle slow down at the end of his driveway. And then it turned in and began to slowly drive up. Very slowly. My boyfriend and I sat in the car looking at each other because we didn't know what the fuck was going on. As it got closer, we went through every possible person it could have been. We even considered my sister, who could have recognized my car and wanted to scare us. It was a reach, since no one we brought up owns a car that looks like that, but I was praying that was the answer. They reached the top and parked maybe 10 feet behind me. Then, they turned off their headlights and sat there. It was too dark to be able to make out what kind of car it was. I kept turning in my seat trying to see if someone was walking around, or if I could catch a glimpse at their vehicle. We sat there for a long time trying to figure out what the hell was happening. We didn't dare step out of the car, and I kept the engine running in case I needed to make a break for it, although they were parked directly behind me, blocking the driveway. I'm not sure how long we sat there for, but there was a good while that nothing happened. Then, I heard a creaky door open and shut. I instinctively pressed the lock button on my door, even though my car was already locked. I watched as a middle-aged or older man came into view in my side mirror. As I watched him step closer, I leaned away from the window towards my boyfriend in the passenger seat, and the man walked up to my window. He had a pretty big gut, and his silver hair was pulled into a ponytail underneath a red cap. He cupped his hands and peered into my car. I can still remember him looking right at me so vividly. His expression was blank. I couldn't even move. Then, he stood back up. He pointed back towards his vehicle, and something I couldn't hear, and then just turned around and left. He didn't turn his headlights back on until he reached the road. When he turned, I could see the dark outline of a truck bed. My boyfriend and I sat there stunned for a long time. My boyfriend and his stepdad drove behind me to my house to make sure no one followed me there either. He hugged me before I went inside, and he said he'd give me an update the next day. No one we knew could explain it, or knew who he was. I haven't seen a similar truck since then, but if I notice a car has been following me for a while, no matter what it looks like, I make sure to take a few extra turns away from my house until they've turned onto a different road. I can't help the sneaking suspicion that things may have gone a lot differently if my boyfriend wasn't in the car with me. Back in my high school years, I'd often meet with a few friends at a local Dunkin' Donuts, which was conveniently near a railway we'd all take to our weed guy's house. My closest friend at the time, Katie, and I usually met up earlier than everyone else to hang out, order our extra large drinks and hash browns, and attempt some "hey mister" shenanigans to score some tall boys from anyone willing to buy us beer. I'd consider us to be pretty naive and overly nice girls, which never proved to be an issue to either of us, until we were nice to the wrong person. Now for a little background of my hometown. I grew up in the forgotten borough of NYC, Staten Island. For those who are unaware, there was, and kind of still is, a pretty horrendous opioid epidemic, so seeing zombie-like civilians strolling the streets is fairly common. Because of this, I became pretty good at spotting out someone struggling with heroin and things of the sort. Anyways, on this one day, Katie and I met up at Dunkin' and sat at our usual booth. We were in the midst of messing around with our phones and being our overly giggly selves when I noticed out of the corner of my eye, someone suddenly stopped outside of the glass door. Still smiling, I glanced over to see if it was maybe one of our friends and ended up making direct eye contact with a basic Staten Island-looking dude. I looked away unbothered and carried on. Just another customer anyways. After the guy got his coffee, he sat directly at the table across from our booth. I chose to ignore the fact he sat weirdly close and resisted eye contact, since that already awkwardly happened. But I guess the motion caught Katie's attention as she looked over her shoulder at the man settling in. She looked back at me, made a face that said, okay, and we just giggled and tried to move on. Every now and then, I glanced in his direction, mainly just because I like to be observant of my surroundings, but also because I kept seeing him scratch at his nose, neck, and face in my peripheral vision, and notice he was bleeding from various little cuts on his body. This was a dead giveaway he was doing some form of opiate, as they tend to get very itchy and scratch until they break skin. A few minutes later, the man asked if one of us had a charger he could borrow. I kindly denied, and Katie only had an iPhone charger while the man clearly had an Android phone. This slight exchange was enough for the man to feel invited, and he'd continue to make comments for quite some time. Being that this was about 4 years ago, I don't remember the entire conversation, but I do remember him often asking general questions like if we live around here, what we do in our free time, and creepy things of the sort. I was pretty vague yet polite in my responses, but Katie was always a bit more enthusiastic in her words, making it pretty easy for this guy to reciprocate and basically join our conversation altogether. In Katie's innocent stupidity, the guy basically found out some of the main train stops we'd get off at to hang in those areas. He also found out we would indulge in the devil's lettuce, which only made this guy feel even more inclined. At some point, he mentioned how his ex-girlfriend got him into some trouble, got him into heroin, which he used to sell, served jail time for, and pretty recently got out. He also mentioned how he's been an ice cream truck driver ever since his release, and told us that he's always driving around the train stops Katie mentioned earlier. He also repeatedly offered to give us rides around his truck someday with free ice cream as the bribe. Again, we were pretty naive and overly nice girls, Katie more so than I, so one thing led to another, and eventually this guy was asking for Katie's social media, which she happily obliged to. She's always been really dedicated to expanding her follower count. Throughout this entire exchange, I was mostly just nodding, smiling, laughing here and there, so my remaining silent during the social media exchange went unnoticed. However, once the guy started following Katie on Instagram, he quickly found mine through a tagged picture on her page. I wasn't private at the time, so he immediately started liking and commenting on nearly every one of my pictures. The comments were extremely cringy, consisting of heart eye and water squirt emojis, and things like, "Damn, ma." Finally, after the longest half hour ever, I urged we should really be catching our train. Fortunately, the man wasn't persistent after that, and we were on our way with no problem. After some verbal recap of what just happened, I convinced Katie to block him, and I did the same. We brushed it off with that. I honestly forgot about the strange interaction until about a week later. I was hanging out with some friends at a park near my high school when Munchies made me crave Ralph's Ices, which was just up the block. I ventured off with one other friend and almost made it to the store before the sound of an ice cream truck approached from behind us. Completely lost in conversation, my attention was only caught by the high-pitched screeching of truck brakes and a somewhat familiar voice. Of course, it was him. He shouted out to me, but with Ralph's only a couple feet in front of us, I ignored him and rushed in with my friend. The guy didn't stick around, being that he was blocking the whole lane on a narrow two-way road, but we still called our friend at the park to pick us up in his car. For the next 2 weeks, there were about 4 times this man tried to pick me up in his truck, at this point making me pretty paranoid I was potentially being stalked. The last time it happened, he was parked directly outside one of the train stops, almost as if he was waiting for me. He again called out to me, asking why I blocked him and saying he just wants to be friends. At this point, I had enough and told him to just leave me alone, and that my dad's a lieutenant in NYPD, which was a lie, of course. I walked away before he could respond and into the diner I was meeting my friends at that night. I saw his truck drive away in the window and never had an interaction with the ice cream man ever again. The sound of an ice cream truck has haunted me ever since.